Throughout the day, we're trying to tailor the sessions to the kinds of questions you're asking. We're manically going through these yellow cards at the front here and taking all the ones from the text as well. Let me encourage you to grab the individuals in the pink lanyards, though, in the breaks too, if you feel, okay, I've had a general answer, but my specific question is this, because we really do want to serve you as much as we can today. So as we think about this question, why does God allow suffering? In the last few months alone in Britain, we have heard about the systematic sexual and physical abuse of over 1,400 young girls in a town in the north of England. We've seen pictures and videos of the beheading of Western journalists and aid workers with a butcher's knife. And we've heard of the disappearance of a 14-year-old girl called Alice on the streets of London. So all of us in this room, while we may personally have lots of happy experiences of life as well, we see and we know that evil is real and that it is at large in our world. We know that darkness coming closer to home. Let me give you an example. Childline reported that self-harm was in the top 5 concerns for 14-year-olds for the first time between 2011 and 2012, for the first time since the surveys were done. But in the first 6 months of 2012 and 13, the age had dropped further, and it appeared for the first time in the top 5 concerns of 13-year-olds. And if you were to read these yellow cards, you would see that that is an issue that is consistently coming up. Many of us struggle with feelings of anxiety, disappointment, perhaps with the broken relationships of our parents, or the struggle to process the violations of our personal dignity through unwanted advances, through bullying or other kinds of abuse. The darkness of the world that you know and that I know is real darkness. This darkness has been experienced by my friend who 2 years ago lost her baby son. He died when he was 5 weeks old. This darkness that is real was experienced by my other close friend who was abused as a child. This darkness is a reality for my husband who was abandoned by his mother as a small child. And the darkness is real as well to my relative who was bullied at school relentlessly for a year. Those people that are close to me, as well as all of you in this room, we know that real suffering, real evil, real darkness in our world and in our experience is not something that any of us are prepared to sweep under the carpet. This question of suffering is of critical importance. Now, when we think about faith or talk about faith, many people perceive faith as some kind of fantasy. It's an embracing of unreality that helps you get through the pain of life. It's like a drug, like Tom was mentioning, that might lift you out of the pain just for a little while. So it may surprise some of us even in this room, but certainly out there in the world, that the Bible does not present the Christian faith as a comfort blanket of a fantasy world. The Bible describes reality as you and I know it, a world in which there is joy and love, but a world in which terrible, sad things happen to ordinary people. The story is told of a little girl who was doing a project on birth at her school. I have 3 children. I have twins who are 9 and a 5-year-old as well. This little girl was 6. And her project was about birth, and she went to her mother and she said, "Well, Mummy, how did I come to be born?" The mum was a bit embarrassed. She wasn't ready to have the chat about the birds and the bees. So she said, "Well, a stork brought you in a blanket and dropped you in our garden." The girl looked a little bit puzzled and said, "Well, Mummy, how did you come to be born?" And the woman didn't know how to stop digging, so she kept on and she said, "Well, a stork brought me as well." The girl looked puzzled and said, well, how did Granny come to be born? And the woman just said, look, a stork brought us all, okay? That's how it happens in our family. The girl went back to school the next day and she wrote in her project, there hasn't been a natural birth in our family for 3 generations. We can avoid facing reality, but the Bible doesn't do that around the question of pain and suffering. The final objective of a Christian faith is not to help you soothe your trouble away with a hallucinogenic palliative, or to pretend that all is well, or to dull the pain, but rather to see reality, grasp the root of our problem, and overcome it. So why does God allow suffering? Is there an explanation? If God is there and he's loving, why do all these bad, terrible things happen? Well, let me begin by saying that, of course, there are lots of layers to addressing this. And all of us in this room are going to come at this question with different experiences. For some of us, it's primarily an intellectual question. It's a theoretical question. We see evil in the world, we hear that there's a God of love, we think, well, why does he let it happen? For some of us, it's personal. Given what I've experienced or what I'm going through right now, where is God? So this talk is just going to be a beginning, but in the short time that we have together, I want you to realize and begin to realize that it is not only Christians who need to answer this question of suffering. Every point of view, wherever you stand on the spectrum of belief, needs to engage with this question of why there is suffering in the world. It's not only God, it's not only the Bible that needs to have an explanation or an answer to this question. And I think it helps us engage with the Christian answer to this question to first of all think about what some of those alternatives might be so that we can see how the Bible's answer compares. So we're going to do that briefly. How do other worldviews engage with this? Well, if we were to take the religion of Islam, Islam is a fatalistic religion. It believes that, it teaches that God is transcendent and he's utterly in control of the universe and that human beings do not have free will. There is only one will in the universe and that is God's will. So that famous word you might have heard a lot, inshallah, means God willing, and that's repeated a lot. Now, the implications of this can be surprising. A few years ago, I was doing some teaching, a lecture on Islam. And afterwards, a guy came up to me and shared an experience that he had had. He had been part of the British forces in Iraq, training the Iraqi army before the British forces were pulled out. And he said they trained them in all sorts of things, but one of the things they did was a survival exercise. And they had a swimming pool, and the troops being trained had to have all their kit on and a pack on, and they were sort of pushed into the swimming pool, and then they had to swim to the surface with everything on. Okay. So they chose the first 2 volunteers, not very many volunteers, but they were selected, and they were pushed into the pool. One of them sunk like a stone to the bottom of the pool and made no movement, and the other swam to the surface. My friend described the sheer panic he felt as he saw this guy, and he thought he was dying. So he dived in and he rescued him. He dragged him to the surface. They slapped him on the back. The water came out. He began to breathe, and he said, "Why didn't you swim?" And the guy shrugged his shoulders. He said, "Inshallah, I knew it was God's will, that God's will would be done, whether I would live or whether I would die. And clearly, since you rescued me, it was God's will that I lived." Islam is a deterministic religion. The goal of the Muslim is to bring one's life and the world into submission to that will. But it means that good and evil, since they exist, are both part of God's will. There is no human will. So the answer of suffering really is in the character, in the hands of God. You just have to shrug your shoulders and accept what life deals you. Well, within Buddhism and other Eastern philosophies, a distinction between good and evil is believed to be illusory, since everything, all of reality, is one. The Buddha left his wife and newborn child to seek enlightenment away from emotional bonds. Enlightenment is essentially disconnection from everything except the realization that all of life is one, and that one is ultimate and impersonal. So trying to make sense of suffering in the world is a kind of failure to understand that suffering is just an illusion and that everything is an illusion. It's a very theoretical and impersonal approach to this, and it doesn't really explain why that suffering is there or help us at all in dealing with it. Well, what about atheism and naturalism? Well, atheists have often said if God was real, he wouldn't allow suffering. Suffering is there, therefore God isn't there. But this question of suffering is itself a moral question. It's the question, how can bad things happen? And that very question assumes a moral framework. God's existence is being called into question on the basis of the moral judgment that suffering is bad and that he's letting these bad things happen. But that kind of moral judgment requires a moral law, an objective moral law, in order to contrast good and evil. Yet if a moral law exists, by consequence there must be a moral lawgiver greater than us. So paradoxically, the reality of evil and suffering is used by some philosophers to argue for God's existence. Now, that may not help me in the dark watches of the night, but it is important that the very objection of atheists, that suffering and evil are a disproof of God, assumes the reality of the God it is trying to disprove. Now, that's not to say that people who don't believe in God can't have morals or behave morally. It's about the grounding and logic of morality. For atheists, morality is not located objectively in God, but subjectively in either personal preference or societal taboo. Richard Dawkins famously said, "We supply our own basis for ethics." But when you look at the suffering world around you, ask yourself the question, is that answer adequate? Don't ISIL in Syria and Iraq believe in what they are doing? Aren't they supplying their own grounds for their own ethic? Who are we to say they are wrong? Don't racists believe that they're morally right in their delusions of superiority over other people? And aren't racist societies who've legalized such notions within their rights to do so on the basis of societal taboo? Who are we to say they're wrong? It is only if there is a God that there is a moral lawgiver who transcends personal preference or the culture of a particular society, that good and evil are real in an absolute sense. And on top of that, if there is no God, if this life is all there is and it's all about the survival of the fittest, why do we as human beings care about darkness, massacres, hunger, injustice, or the sufferings of other human beings, the strong eliminating the weak? Why does darkness hurt? Why does it matter? From where do we get that essential sense of the worth and dignity of human beings? Our human outrage in the face of suffering, including of people that we don't know, speaks of our intuitive sense that there is more to life than atheism tells us there is. If God is there then, and atheism, Islam and Buddhism don't adequately explain why there is suffering and why we feel as we do in the face of suffering, how could the God of love we read about in the Bible allow the evil we see around us in the world? I've already said that the Bible doesn't deny the darkness of the world, but why does God allow it? Well, the Bible talks in the book of Genesis about human beings being created in the image of God, that there is this godlikeness about us, and that our lives are essentially valuable. The Bible's response to the question of why God allows suffering is rooted in us, the human beings, and in our free will. The Bible talks about a good God creating a good world and specifically making creatures who have the capacity to love. Now, for love to really truly exist, freedom must also exist. When I was the age of a lot of you, 15, I lived in Birmingham in the inner city. My dad was a vicar there, and it was quite an interesting community to grow up in. But I remember as a 15-year-old, I became friends with a girl whose parents were trying to force her into a marriage with someone she'd never met. She was 15 and she was afraid. And she had good reason to be afraid, because a close relative of hers the previous year had been in exactly the same position. She had tried to run away, but she had been knocked down by a car in the street, dragged by her hair back to her house, and forcibly taken out of the country to marry. No one had seen her or heard from her again. My friend Shabs, at 15, knew she didn't want that. She wanted to love and to be loved. She felt that being forced into a legal partnership by her parents with someone she did not know and then being raped on a regular basis by that person was the antithesis of love. She believed that love, the love she was capable of giving and receiving, could not and should not be compelled by another person. And so friends of mine helped her to get to a safe house and to escape from that situation. The Bible tells us that God is love and that he creates human beings who are capable of giving and receiving love. And for that love to be possible, freedom must be there. For true love to be real, it must be freely offered and received. We all know this to be the case. And Genesis tells us that that's how reality is, that there is a God who made the world in which love is possible. But that means that there's a world in which there is freedom, and that human beings have used that freedom to harm as well as to love. And that's why there is joy and happiness in life, but that is why there is also suffering in this world. Genesis describes the impact of the choices human beings have made on ourselves, on other people, and on the environment of the earth itself. But the Bible doesn't just address the question of why bad things happen. There's a deeper kind of answer in the person of Jesus as well. Because at the cross, we encounter the God of love who suffers with us and for us. Jesus describes himself as the light of the world, and he bears our darkness and our sin, paying the price for us. The God of love suffers for us, carrying away at the cross the consequences of the darkness in us. And that's why the cross is so amazing. One of the questions that I really noticed here in the yellow cards was, what's all this about the cross? That's why the cross is so amazing, because it introduces us to the God of love who's with us in the dirt and darkness of this world. A cartoon was found on the wall of the ruins of ancient Rome, and it showed how people perceived the Christian message when they heard it. It's a caricature of Jesus' crucifixion, and it shows a man's body hanging on a cross, but the body has the head of a donkey. And underneath this picture, there's a man kneeling down, raising his hands in worship, and the inscription, he worships his God. It was a satire, a crucified God, a God who would allow himself to bear the brokenness and darkness and violation of the world was unconscionable. It was extraordinary. Now, the cross is familiar to you and I. We wear it around our necks. We maybe have tattoos of it. We have it in our ears. It's so fundamental, but think how extraordinary it is that on the top of buildings, on the top of the greatest universities of the world, in graveyards, in order to remember great lives, we see images of the cross. You would think it's strange if you met someone at a drinks party who wore a gold chain with an electric chair or a hangman's noose hanging around their neck. But it's not strange to see the cross, because Jesus' death was for us, God coming to earth as a perfect human being and dying for us, showing his love. No other death is anything like this. But the cross also shows us that the God of love suffers not just for us, but with us. God is not a man with a white beard distantly in the clouds. In Jesus, he enters our world of sweat and blood and tears. He experiences unimaginable physical pain, betrayal, abuse, spiritual anguish on our behalf. He's the God of love who promises his presence with us as we suffer. And we know that that can be a reality since Jesus went to the cross. When we suffer, we're not alone. Now, when my child falls down and the blood flows, which happens a lot since I have 3 boys, he needs me to pick him up and hold him in my arms. And sometimes that is not very pleasant, but that's what love does. I remember just a few months ago, I was taking my 5-year-old Benji, who really loves tennis, and he just played an amazing match against an 8-year-old and won. Proud mother moment. And we were driving somewhere, and he really suffers from car sickness. My twins were with us, and we'd stopped at the petrol station, and he was standing in front of me and the twins, and he just started to cry. And because I know him, I knew what was coming, and I just went to him and hugged him as he vomited all over me, in my hair, all over my clothes, all over everything. The twins ran away going, "Oh, that's disgusting." But I was with him in his suffering. I know that he will remember that. I want to be the kind of mother who hugs her son in the rubbish moments, who's there with him when he suffers, who's not only interested in his achievements and when he's performing well. And that is how God loves us. This is extraordinary. There's no other faith, there's no other description of a God who loves like that. He loves us in our pain, in our mistakes, and when we're victims of violations, he is with us and for us. Jesus said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." We may suffer. We may be persecuted. We may stumble. In fact, the Bible promises that we will suffer. The Bible doesn't deny the painful experiences that we will go through, but John's gospel tells us the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The promise is not, come to Jesus and you'll never suffer, but come to him. He will cleanse you. He will heal you. His light will deal with the darkness within, and any darkness thrown at you when he is there will not overcome the light. I've seen him do this in my own experience, from seeing teenagers rescued from gang violence and paedophile rings in London, to meeting the leaders of the Taliban in Afghanistan and seeing them receive a Bible with joy in their military headquarters, to seeing super rich city bankers knowing their desperate need for a saviour and encountering him, the light of the world. He is the light, his face, his presence with us. The Bible is not just an explanation of why there is suffering because there's free will and love is possible, but also it introduces us to the God who, through Christ, actually experiences suffering and helps and rescues us in the midst of this dark world we all know and recognise. The possibility of love leaves open the possibility of suffering, but God doesn't leave us there alone with just an explanation. He himself comes to us. And then when Jesus is in us, we become part of God's answer to a suffering world. Thank you for listening.